We know, of course, testing and tracing are so key when it comes to containing the spread of COVID-19, especially, as you saw there with New Brunswick, as we start to reopen more and more of their economies every day. Okay, I want to show you some stats now, if I can, that my producer, Phil, put together for me, that really give you paint a picture, an important picture, I think, of what's happening across the country in terms of the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. So if you look at those statistics there are more than 1,100 positive cases in Quebec and Ontario. In the whole rest of the country, just to give you a whole sense of this, there are 49 positive cases of COVID-19 in the whole rest of the country. Now, part of this is, of course, population size, the sheer size of the province. Part of it is also how testing has unfolded in Quebec and Ontario. So let me show you what that looks like. We'll start in Quebec, where the number of people tested on Tuesday, well, here's Ontario. The number of people tested on Wednesday was just over 10,500. The goal, remember, on a daily basis, Premier Doug Ford has said, is to be 20,000. And 10,000 was actually a high number for this week. Let me show you how they are doing in Quebec when it comes to testing in relation to what their goal is, closing in on 11,500. And their goal, their daily, has been 14,000, which they have not yet hit once. So those numbers are important so that we understand that while some provinces are doing a really good job at testing and tracing and keeping their case count down, the provinces that still have the most cases and the most deaths are struggling with getting that testing and tracing numbers up. Remember that Quebec accounts for more than half of the cases and almost 60% of the deaths in this country, mostly, of course, due to long-term care deaths. But still, this is a challenge that the Prime Minister wanted to speak to the premiers about yesterday. And I'll bring in my colleagues, the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapelis, and the CBC's Catherine Cullen, to help talk a little bit more about that. So those statistics, when you look at them and you see what the targets are and what they're doing and how there had been even worse, much worse days in Ontario before that, it does show, I think, in a really concrete way that things have to improve and that the federal government is willing to do whatever it takes to try and get these two big provinces at where they need to be, essentially, Vashi.
And I think it also raises questions for a number of people who live in both Ontario and Quebec about the rollout plans or the phased out approach to reopening the economy.
Sure.
In both provinces, it's kicked off, and I'll use a couple of examples. Mayors Patrick Brown and Bonnie Crombie, both mayors of cities within the GTA, where 60% of the cases in Ontario exist right now, have heard from their chief public health official who says, I'm not sure about the reopening. I think it's going too quickly, seeing the spread of the virus in this region right now. The hardest part, or the biggest challenge that they have, is that Dr. David Williams, for example, who heads up public health for Ontario, is admitting that they aren't able to, at this point, figure out the source of community spread. There still is community spread. It isn't completely isolated to long-term care homes, for example, and they can't figure out what the source of that spread is at this point. So these mayors are openly questioning whether things are going too quickly because of what they're hearing from their own regions, from public health officials there. Now, contrast that with Premier Stephen McNeil in Nova Scotia, where there are far fewer cases, far less community spread. They have so far identified the majority of the sources of community spread. They still haven't even broached the reopening of their economy. They don't plan to do so until sometime in June. They haven't even isolated a specific day. And the Premier says that's because they don't want to open up and have to close down again. We have seen that happen to a certain degree in other jurisdictions. And I think that sort of underscores exactly what you laid out with those statistics, right? Like, at the end of the day, those are numbers, they are people, but they also, I think, we expect will inform the plans that provinces have to reopen. And I know that there is great economic pressure, particularly, of course, in Ontario and Quebec, because there has been a lot of suffering economically since everything shut down. But the fear exists, and as I said, mayors are openly talking about it, that the speed at which this is happening right now could force things to get even worse in the future, and especially around that conversation, for example, where a second wave is concerned. That could be of particular concern in Ontario and Quebec as well. That's where all this testing and tracing comes into play. And my understanding is, based on the conversation that the premiers had with the Prime Minister, that the sort of tension points in the conversation exist primarily around Ontario and Quebec as well. It isn't as much of an ask from other provinces, for example.
No.
The feds say we'll bankroll it. They had a big conversation last week. Not a lot of plans put forward from provinces in the meantime. Now they have some idea of what provinces need, and primarily those are from provinces that are already doing a pretty good job of particularly testing, although tracing capability across the country needs to improve. But Ontario and Quebec continue to be pressure points in that discussion as well.
Yeah, that's a really good summary of where that's at, particularly when you have the Premier of Quebec being asked, well, listen, you're not doing well. Why are you still moving forward with reopening parts of Montreal, the island of Montreal, for instance? And he says, well, I'm a bit impatient about the testing, but it's not clear to me why there is such impatience, Catherine, and I'll bring you in because we've heard the same from the Premier of Ontario, when there also seems to be a solution on the table. Maybe I'm misreading what the conversation is between the feds and the provinces, but it seems like this is solvable. So I'm not really sure why we're in this position in these two provinces.
Yeah, well, let's talk about a few things. Perhaps first contrasting Ontario and Quebec. You're right, Rosemary, that François Legault was saying yesterday, I'm impatient to see more tests. At the same time, though, he is bristling a bit at the criticism. He did say that he feels that the level of testing right now in the province is good, but that it could be better. You showed those numbers earlier. Quebec is perhaps a few thousand tests a day from where it would like to be, as opposed to Ontario, which the latest figures was only at half, and as you said, even lower numbers earlier in the week. Doug Ford, you have him banging this drum week after week. I am obsessed with testing. I'm going to be an 800-pound gorilla, he said, on the backs of these officials trying to get this done. So why are we not seeing higher numbers? Well, I was speaking to Dr. Isaac Bogosh yesterday, infectious disease expert in Toronto. He said there are a few factors here, and that's something that Quebec acknowledges as well in terms of why this testing isn't happening. Part of it is equipment, that there are still some shortfalls, and we see this in the discussion between the Prime Minister and the Premiers, that part of what is on offer is lab capacity, the physical equipment, also personnel when it comes to things like contact tracing and whatnot, but just the stuff to get this done. The other half of the equation, though, is getting people out to be tested. Dr. Bogosh said, perhaps it's not clear to people at this time that they can go out and get tested. Certainly in the beginning of the pandemic, the opening weeks, there were stricter criteria about who could be tested. People didn't necessarily know that they could get a test. So he really encourages broad communication that people can be tested. Doug Ford going a bit further than that and saying we have to go out and start testing. He talked yesterday about the prospect of random testing, about testing in particular neighborhoods where there are hotspots. Uber drivers, taxi drivers, limo drivers, people in the food service sector, people in the automotive sector. It was really a laundry list of people he says he's open to seeing tested. He has told officials, he said, in his province that he wants to see a new plan. He's promising to folks that there is going to be something coming on testing as of about Monday. But certainly he's pitching something much broader. Federal officials are saying across the country, we heard it from the Prime Minister yesterday, financial concerns, logistical concerns, they should not be what's driving this. This is a major priority, and the federal government, and it sounds like really all officials who are getting in front of cameras and talking about this, want everyone to do better.
Okay, that really interesting context there as well. I'm going to leave you both just for a moment, if you don't mind. We are expecting the Prime Minister as well to highlight some of the aid packages that have been put forward for the government. And of course, we know there are many businesses that have been hurting during the pandemic. One of them is owned by our next guest, Mike Medeiros. He's a mushroom farmer, and he joins me now from Osgoode, a rural part of Ontario. Hey, Mike, how you doing? Mark, sorry.
Good, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm good. Mike. Okay, it said one thing, and it said one thing before and one thing after. Right. I thought I'd see you outside with the mushrooms, Mike, but you're inside. Tell me what has happened to your production since this began.
So once the restaurants were all closed down, that was basically 40% of our production. So with the mushroom industry, you're 7 weeks before you can make a change. So basically you have 7 weeks of production before you can start cutting back or making necessary changes. So once that happened, we had to find a new home for all the product that we were producing, which was very, very tough. So we basically gave a lot of mushrooms away to soup kitchen food banks in Ottawa and Montreal to help offset the loss. Some of the rooms on the second flush, we weren't able to harvest it. We just had to basically get rid of it, so we wouldn't put in extra production in our fridge. Now what's happened is the retail sector has picked up and has helped a lot. So more people are cooking at home, which you can see on people are tweeting and on Facebook, they're cooking more, they're making pizzas and whatnot. So a lot more mushrooms are being consumed retail-wise now. The problem, not a problem, but with that, your packaging is totally different. So you're basically harvesting all the mushrooms in small packages, 8-ounce packages, versus a 5-pound box, which was going towards the restaurants. So now our harvesting days are a lot longer, packaging's a lot longer. So we're finishing later. We need more staff. We're a little short-staffed right now. Some people don't feel comfortable working. They're scared. We've implemented a lot of new changes around the farm to keep everyone safe. But it's frustrating, and it's stressful, actually.
Yeah, I would imagine. So you've adapted, it sounds like, in some ways, but you also said, I guess, that you had to, when you said get rid of, I imagine you were dumping some of your produce. Was that the case? Because there was just nowhere to put it.
Right. So basically, the last 3-4 days of harvesting, we wouldn't harvest some of those rooms. And then when you steam off the room and the compost goes out to be composted for mushroom compost, for gardens and whatnot, the product just wasn't harvested. So we got rid of it that way, unfortunately. We definitely didn't want to do that.
How much did you lose there, Mike?
We had a few weeks where we were upwards of 20,000 pounds a week.
Which would be what in dollars for you?
Just over $40-something thousand a week.
That's a lot. So the government has obviously put forward, a bunch of money for farmers and producers, $250 million, if I'm not mistaken. What have you been able to tap into any aid? Has any of the government's moves helped you in any way?
No, there hasn't been anything to basically help the mushroom sector. Basically, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture was asking for $2.6 billion to help the ag-food sector across Canada and to secure our food supply in Canada. And the $252 million basically falls very short of what was needed. And so for our industry, we haven't been able to tap into any funds to help out. A lot of farms, which I basically talked to, have extra housing costs, transportation costs to house their workers. And so none of that's we're able to recoup. So it basically our margins have eroded.
Sure.
At the moment.
Yeah, I understand that there was a desire for more. The Prime Minister did make it pretty clear that more was forthcoming, that he realized that this was a first attempt. Some of the things you mentioned there, though, sound like things that the government had put forward in that initial package, that there was going to be help if you needed to buy more fridges or you needed to help, change the way you're working so that the workers feel safe. Have you done any of those things yet?
Yeah, so some of the farms that I've talked to, they've rented more like hotel spaces and whatnot in the rural areas to house the workers, to segregate them, basically more spacing. So the funding that some of the government put out was for new workers coming into the country. It's not helping the workers that are already here. So some of the farms that are social distancing amongst the houses that they have for their workers is not allowed in that funding.
Okay. Mike, how are you feeling about the future?
It's scary. Like, we have about just over 100 staff, and every day we try and keep everyone safe. We're taking temperatures, we're sanitizing more. Just going around the farm, I'm looking at a thermal imaging unit to put on my farm as well. It's scary. You don't want anyone to get sick. And I know what we've done has helped. If I look back to last year, February, March, April, I've got no staff this year that's sick with the flu or cold, where last year I was missing staff with flu and colds. So we know what we're doing is working, it's helping, but it's scary. You go home at night and you want your family to stay safe, and you want your team to be safe. So it's scary.
Mike, thanks for making the time to talk with us today. I realize it's a stressful time for many people. I hope that things improve for you and stay safe.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. That's Mike Medeiros. He's a mushroom farmer just outside of Ottawa. While we wait, as you can see there, they're setting up the podium for the Prime Minister outside of Rideau Cottage. He is expected today earlier than usual at 10:30 Eastern, and we are expecting him to talk a little bit more about what we were discussing earlier, testing and contact tracing, something that he did discuss with the premiers last night. But as we wait, I want to bring in another guest if I can. This is Bill Black. He's a veteran, one of the 26,000 Canadians who served in the Korean War 70 years ago. It's often called Canada's Forgotten War, but we were coming up on the 70th anniversary of the beginning of that war, and the Republic of Korea found a way to thank Canadian vets for their contribution, namely by sending masks to Korean vets around the world. Bill, nice to see you. You got all dressed up for me. I appreciate that, sir.
Well, thank you. I thought I'd better show off my green jacket. So many of our veterans wear them in the association.
Yes, indeed, and I appreciate it. I must say, I heard you on the radio with my friend Robin earlier this week, and I found your conversation so touching, and what the Korean government did also so touching. Tell me how you felt about this donation of masks. I know there was a ceremony yesterday.
Well, we heard about it on the 23rd of April at the Battle of Kapyong ceremony, when the ambassador and the defense attaché asked me whether we thought that masks would be appropriate for our veterans, and I said absolutely. And I was quite thrilled to hear that South Korea, unable to commemorate and hold a reception in June, have now delivered another method of paying their tribute to our Canadian soldiers of the Korean War. And yesterday at the embassy, we had a short reception and received 4 large boxes of these, I don't know if you can see them or not, these wonderful masks that will be distributed across Canada to the consulates, the Korean consulates in Vancouver, Montreal, and Toronto. And of course, yesterday they provided me with 2,835 for our Korea veterans in the city of Ottawa.
That's great, and they did send 1 million around the world to other vets in other countries who had contributed, to the Korean War. What did that mean to you? That you know, Korea, understanding that you can't have the events that were planned, but that they wanted to reach out at a time when everyone is sort of dealing with the stress of this. What did it mean to you?
Well, I think it's a wonderful gesture and very meaningful. It means that our veterans will be able to be a little more mobile. A lot of them do not have masks, and they're always now concerned about getting out in the public. So when they go shopping, to the bank, or around the neighborhoods, now that things are opening up again, they will have not only the comfort of wearing these masks, but the comfort of knowing where they came from. It will stir their memories as it has stirred mine.
Tell me in what way it has stirred your memories of your time serving in that war.
Well, to begin with, we had not done much with Korea after the war. We all went on to different walks of life. However, I stayed in the military for 35 years, and I was always in acquaintance with many of the veterans from the Korean War in the Navy. So when they come up with the idea of having an association 40 years ago, I joined, and it is very meaningful to know that Korea has also remembered all of the veterans across the world, the soldiers who served, the men and women who served in Korea, and they began inviting the Canadians and the other countries' veterans and their families to visit Korea. And these visits were paid for by the Korean government, the Ministry of Patriots and Veterans Affairs, Korea. And of course, all the Korean young men serve in the military, so they have one of the largest military services in the world. So we've been connecting with them for the last 40 years.
Amazing. They still think about what you did to help them, and obviously are still very grateful. I know, Mr. Black, that the average age of Korean vets is about 88 right now. So obviously that means that many of the Korean vets in this country and elsewhere are sort of part of the vulnerable population that could get COVID-19. Is that of concern to you, that many of your friends or veterans that you know might fall ill?
Well, many have. We had in our unit here in Ottawa 20 years ago around 240 veterans, and we're down to 80 now.
Yeah.
Many have passed away. I've attended many of the funerals, sadly. And the interesting thing is that for all of these soldiers, veterans who have passed away, the Korean embassy have also attended these funerals and delivered their condolences to the families. So the connection is probably one of the greatest in the world from the point of view of remembering those who served to save Korea.
That's very nice to hear. One of the things the Prime Minister has said about this pandemic, about COVID-19 since the beginning, is that we should all serve our country in the same way that you and your friends and your colleagues did. And obviously it's a much easier service that we have today. Just stay home, stay safe, wash our hands. When you hear the Prime Minister making that comparison and calling people to service in a different way, what do you think of that?
To serve in a different way, in what respect, I might ask?
In terms of just protecting one another by staying home and staying safe and staying 2 meters apart.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That is paramount if we wish to remain safe. And I hope all of our veterans are abiding by those very important regulations about the distancing and remembering to wash their hands, etc. That's absolutely essential, and I hope all of our veterans are obeying those regulations, if I may. We lost another veteran at the Pearly Rideau Veterans Health Center. That's similar to the Veterans Hospital in Toronto. And I don't know whether he passed away from COVID-19. I never inquired, but nonetheless, 2 days ago he passed away. Now, of course, we cannot attend any funerals, which is rather heartbreaking.
Yes.
To know that we can't visit their families and offer our condolences in person. So I hope everybody follows the rules, regulations, and we get over this crisis of COVID-19 as quickly as possible.
I do too. Bill Black, it was very nice to meet you. Thank you for making the time for us today, sir, and I do appreciate you putting the uniform on too.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed speaking with you, and Toronto is my hometown. I was born there, so I have
very good.
I still have a love for Toronto.
Well, you look like $1 million, Mr. Black. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart.
All right, stay
Bye.
safe. That's Bill Black. He's a Canadian veteran who served in the Korean War, as we were talking about there. South Korea sent 1 million masks to Korean War vets around the world who participated in that war, including Mr. Black there, who was at a ceremony yesterday at the embassy. Okay, we're just a few minutes away from the Prime Minister coming out of his front door there at Rideau Cottage, a little bit earlier than usual at 10:30 Eastern. He also has a cabinet meeting later today and a call with I think related to the United Nations bid that the government is continuing to push forward on. The vote is sometime later in June, I believe, and Canada still hoping to get a seat at the Security Council. I'll bring in Vashi Kapelis and the CBC's Catherine Cullen. Love meeting regular people experiencing different ways and different things through this, including Bill Black, who's been through a lot already in his late 80s and is still able to use Skype and get dressed up for us in the morning. So that's all great to see that he's doing very well. We are expecting, obviously, to hear the Prime Minister talk about testing and tracing, Vashi. But I wonder whether I don't think he will weigh in on this, but at your point that we started off with, the fact that there are questions now about whether things are happening too quickly and how far the Prime Minister can go down that road if this was an actual concern for him or if it's something that he raised with premiers last night.
Yeah, I think your wager is probably a safe one in nearly every instance that he's been asked that type of question. Anything that would almost render a judgment on something that is provincial jurisdiction, he is very careful not to. Most federal politicians are, but I think the question is likely one to be put to him just because there are so many people who live in both Ontario and Quebec. And to my earlier point, not just those of us talking amongst ourselves, but actually political representatives of some of the regions that have been hit the hardest within those provinces are raising those kinds of questions. And so it's a fair question to put to the federal government. I mean, they are investing money. They are bankrolling the idea of increasing capacity. I think I'll be looking for some more specifics on what exactly that means from the Prime Minister, especially where, let's say, contact tracing is concerned. There's this whole talk, and we were talking about it yesterday. You had a guest on around what apps can be used. Does it have to be more universal? Like, is the federal government going to be driving that boat? And if so, how do they plan on doing it? If they are bankrolling it, to what end? And especially in Ontario and Quebec, what does that mean? What have the provinces specifically asked for? What can the federal government provide? And what remains in the middle? And how long are we looking at, right? These are all capacity questions, but how quickly can capacity be ramped up? And I think Catherine's point was an especially important one, and one I've heard from a number of infectious disease specialists as well, particularly in Ontario and Quebec. The criteria for getting tested was far less quick. It was far slower to expand versus other provinces. So in Alberta, for about a month, they've thought, well, if I'm asymptomatic or just have any kind of symptom, I can probably get a test. Most people in Ontario were told by their doctors, unless you've traveled or unless you work in a long-term care home, you probably won't get a test. And that only changed a few weeks ago. So even from a mental standpoint of trying to get used to that idea and thinking, I feel fine, I can get tested, we're way far away from that in Ontario and Quebec, and that contributes to the capacity issue as well.
I would add quickly too, if we have a moment,
Yeah.
Rosemary, just for the relevance for folks outside of Ontario and Quebec. We've made the point about that being where the majority of cases are now. But the Prime Minister said yesterday this is also this broader effort. He has called it a national framework on testing and tracing. It's also about the second wave, and he said yesterday this is about being able to respond virtually immediately when cases do start to swell up, and that is going to happen, everyone believes, in different locations across the country going forward.
That's right, and I should point out too that this conversation around apps, and I know that there are different conversations in different provinces around apps to use, around the benefit also of human contact tracing, which I don't think anyone thinks is a replacement for an app. But Apple and Google have put together this contact tracing platform where they will provide some of the data that people who use their phones, but they will only provide it to one app per country. So Canada has not reached an agreement with them right now, but it's because they don't want the data spread out across multiple apps in one country. And so I think there's also some questions around the urgency to come to an agreement on an app that would be used nationally, or if that's something that they particularly care about, or if that's something, is this data that Apple and Google are providing of use? Do they have to find a way to coordinate that? Those are all the questions that I don't think have been resolved. I don't think they've been resolved after the conversation last night. But if you have, a different, there's our 2-minute warning there. That's how we get it, just in case you didn't know. I wonder how that's going to be managed and negotiated too, because every province has a different take even on how they want to do contact tracing, Vashi.
Yeah, and actually we already see evidence of that. So for example, for a number of weeks in Alberta, they've been using an app. In British Columbia, there's an app to a certain degree, but the Premier said, I don't want ankle bracelets or anything to that effect. So there are already provincial approaches to this. And if a federal one, a coordinated approach is necessary, or if only one app can be used across the country at some point, like if the discussion arrives at that point, we're kind of already playing catch up, right? There's already some discrepancies within the country. And I think that the idea of a federal mandate or some level of federal coordination is of utmost importance at this juncture, right? Because as Catherine puts it, the second wave is not just a concern in Ontario and Quebec. It's going to be a concern right across the country. You hope by that point, I mean, look what happened in South Korea, right? They were able to identify it, test 1,000 people, find out 100 positive people. Like, it was 24 hours. Yeah. And they had made decisions about what they needed to close, where they needed to close it. It was very targeted. And that's what increased testing and increased contact tracing does. It allows you to, when the inevitable second wave hits, to be able to target the response rather than a blanket shutdown of the economy once again. So for the, in addressing concerns around the economy, which are of course so important right now, it goes hand in hand, right? Like this is not just about public health. It's about being able to shut down parts of the economy or areas geographically instead of a blanket shutdown like the one we've already experienced and was already so devastating.
Yeah, and the shutdown, it's worth reminding people, was not only to flatten that curve, which we largely have, and allow the healthcare system to have the capacity in case there was a surge, but it was also to buy us some time to prepare for what was going to come next. And so that meant ramping up our, how much PPE we were going to get, the number of ventilators we're still procuring, but also getting all of these things in place so that if something happens, as you say, Dr. Tam talks often about the spark. If you get a spark of the virus somewhere, that you can go in, test and contact trace and shut it down very quickly instead of having to go into a 10-week lockdown as we have. All right, here comes the Prime Minister of Canada out of his home. We'll talk to both of you in just a moment. But for now, on this Friday, the Prime Minister of Canada.
Hello, everyone. This morning, we awoke to terrible news coming out of Pakistan. A Pakistan International Airlines plane carrying over 100 passengers crashed in a residential neighborhood in Karachi. My heart goes out to all the victims and their families. Our thoughts are with Pakistan today. We're starting a bit earlier this morning because we have a cabinet meeting early this afternoon, so thank you all for joining us now. Last night, the premiers and I held our 10th weekly call since the beginning of the crisis. And we talked about what's been on everyone's mind lately, how we can safely reopen the economy. Over the past few months, Canadians have been doing a great job of staying at home, maintaining physical distancing, and listening to public health advice. And that means we can restart some activities, but we're not out of the woods yet. COVID-19 remains a serious health threat. We have to proceed with caution and keep listening to science, or we risk losing the progress we've made. So today, I want to outline what we know needs to happen to successfully reopen the economy and adjust to our new normal. First, we need to continue scaling up our testing capacity so we can quickly identify new cases and isolate them. We're working with provinces and territories to expand testing by procuring things like reagents and swabs. While some provinces have the capacity to meet their current needs, we're collaborating to ramp up testing so we can protect Canadians and effectively manage future outbreaks. Second, we need to accelerate our ability to do contact tracing. After we've confirmed and isolated new cases, we have to get in touch with everyone who may have been exposed to the virus and make sure they take measures to quarantine and monitor themselves for symptoms or get tested. While provinces and territories are managing testing and contact tracing differently, our government has trained federal employees who can make 3,600 contact tracing calls a day, 7 days a week. Statistics Canada has also an additional 1,700 interviewers ready to go who can make up to 20,000 calls a day. These federal resources are available to assist provinces and territories with any surges or backlogs or challenges they have in contact tracing. We're already helping to make calls in Ontario and stand ready to help anywhere else. Third, we have to ensure that data collected across jurisdictions is shared between provinces and territories. This will help us track the spread of the virus, adapt our response accordingly, and save lives. Aujourd'hui, je veux souligner ce qu'il faut faire pour
I
réussir
want to
la
talk about
réouverture
what
de
we need to do
l'économie
to
et
ensure a
s'adapter
successful
à notre
reopening
nouvelle
of the
réalité.
economy and an adjustment to the new reality. First, we must continue to increase our testing capacity so that we can quickly detect and isolate any new cases. Second, we must be able to quickly contact people who have been exposed so that they can self-isolate and monitor their symptoms or get tested. While the provinces and territories are conducting testing and doing their contact tracing a little differently, our government has trained federal employees who are now prepared to step up and help to find people who've been exposed to the virus across the country. These employees can make 3,600 calls a day, 7 days a week. Furthermore, Statistics Canada has made available 1,700 interviewers who can make up to 20,000 calls a day. We are already making those calls in Ontario, and we are offering our assistance to anyone who needs it. Third, we have to ensure that the data collected by the provinces and territories are shared right across the country. That will help us to follow the spread of the virus, to adapt our response accordingly, and to save lives.
Now, Canada is a vast country, and some regions have been hit harder than others by the pandemic. That's why plans to relax restrictions vary from one jurisdiction to another. But in order for people to move around freely and start getting back to normal life, we have to improve our ability to quickly pinpoint the virus and isolate it. All premiers recognize how important this is, and I want to thank them for their engagement in this issue. Since the beginning of this crisis, all jurisdictions have been working towards one common goal: protecting Canadians. The next phase of our collaborative efforts is on testing, contact tracing, and data collection. And I've told the premiers that the federal government is here to support, facilitate, and fund this important work. Taking strong, collaborative action to expand testing and contact tracing is important for both Canadians and businesses to have confidence that we're on the right foot. They need to know that we have a coordinated approach to gradually reopen that is rooted in science, evidence, and the ability to rapidly detect and control any future outbreaks.
In order for people to be able to move around freely again and get back to their usual routine, we must be able to quickly detect and isolate any new cases. All the premiers understand just how important that is, and we agree. From the beginning of this crisis, all orders of government have been working together to protect Canadians. The next phase of our collaboration will focus on testing, contact tracing, and data sharing. And as I said to my colleagues right across the country, the federal government will be there to support, facilitate, and fund that work. It's important for Canadians, as it is for businesses, to know that we are cooperating in order to step up the testing and contact tracing. The last few months have been very difficult for everyone because we're going through a period of uncertainty, and life was turned upside down overnight. But we put in place certain measures to help people get through the crisis, whether you're a student, a retiree, or unemployed. And if you need help but you're not sure where to begin, we now have a new online tool that can help you. Go to canada.ca coronavirus benefits to get more information. You can answer a couple of questions and the tool will give you a list of programs that you are eligible for.
We've set up a number of programs to help everyone from students to parents to seniors get through this crisis. If you need support but you're not quite sure where to start, we now have a new online tool to help you. Just go to canada.ca/coronavirus benefits. You'll find a list of a few simple questions, and the tool will generate an array of programs for which you may be eligible. I want to close today by addressing the significant increase in acts of racism against Asian Canadians. Over the past few weeks and months, businesses, buildings, and statues have been vandalized. People have been verbally abused and physically attacked. It's unacceptable. Hate, violence, and discrimination have no place in Canada. This is not who we are as Canadians. I want to thank those who have stood up against violence and exposed what is happening in our communities. We need to speak out against racism wherever it is found so we can stop it. To Asian Canadians across the country, know that we all stand with you. We will not let hate divide us. Merci tout le monde.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone for questions. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Première question, Marie Lastel, Le Devoir. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to talk about the contact tracing and testing. You did discuss this in your conversation with the premiers. And I would like to know whether you arrived at an agreement on a national contact tracing strategy. And does that include using mobile applications for contact tracing? And if so, are we talking about voluntary use or what exactly? Now, right across the country, we now have the ability to conduct 60,000 tests a day, but we are not yet at that point because a number of regions do not need to increase the pace of their testing because the situation there is more under control. But in other regions, we will be there to support providing the necessary materials. We talked to the provinces last evening, and we've been talking to them for a number of weeks now to find out what their specific testing needs are and also what they need to do to increase their contact tracing. As I said, we have set up a network of public servants that are prepared to help the provinces with their testing. But the first step is really understanding what the needs are and what the plans are in every province and territory. And we're working very closely with Ontario now on contact tracing, and we will be there to help any other province or territory that requires assistance. We just need them to ask us what can be done to increase the pace of that testing and contact tracing. With respect to applications, we're continuing to work on that, and we'll have more to say about that in the coming days.
We have, from the very beginning, highlighted how important it is to increase testing capacity. We have currently a testing capacity around 60,000 tests a day, but that capacity hasn't been reached yet anywhere in the country because we have a number of provinces that don't have to augment all that much their testing capacity because things are under control. But everyone needs to be ready in case there is a surge, which is why we're moving forward on ensuring that there is that testing capacity, and we continue to ramp it up. In regards to contact tracing, we know that that is an essential element as we move forward. We're working very closely with Ontario. We've developed a public service approach federally that is there to support the mechanisms in the province to do that contact tracing, and we're ramping it up. But we also are there, obviously, to help any other province that would need help with contact tracing, and we've asked provinces to highlight for us what their plans are and how we can help with that. In regards to the app, we continue to work on that and hopefully have things to share in the coming days or weeks.
Marie?
Follow up?
Sur un autre sujet, alors,
On another topic, Parliament is expected to return on Monday. It has been suggested that the Parliament be able to sit and discuss many other issues. So, do you agree that it's time to expand Parliament's activities And should MPs be able to address any subject other than the pandemic? First of all, we're in a situation where the pandemic has become our everyday reality for all Canadians, and we have to take action and respond accordingly. And of course, there's no doubt that that is our priority as a government. We want to be there to help Canadians during this crisis, but it's also the priority of all parliamentarians. But there are conversations occurring right now with the different parties in the House of Commons to see how we can return to work and how we should do that. Canadians know full well that we need a functioning parliament during this crisis, and that's exactly what we're seeking to do.
Merci. Prochaine question. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Émilie Bergeron, Agence QMI. À vous.
Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. For a number of weeks, you've been talking about the importance of doing more testing, and yet in a number of clinics, the number of tests is not very significant, even in the Greater Montreal region. So what do you say to Canadians who are hesitating to go and get tested? Well, we need to do much more testing. That is how we will be able to control the reopening of the economy and control the spread of the virus. That's important. And I know that the provinces may have different approaches to this, but we do need to ramp up the pace of testing. And a number of provinces are now expanding the scope of their testing protocols so that anyone who wants to get tested can. But it will also be important to ramp up the contact tracing as well and encourage people who may be infected with COVID to get tested as well. A follow-up? Yes. Now, do you consider that immigration levels should stay the same? I think it's important to understand that we have paused our economy for the time being. There are a lot of people that have to stay home and cannot work. But as soon as the economy starts up again, we will need workers. I know and I'm confident that the Canadian economy will rebound, and newcomers to this country are an important part of the growth that we're going to have in this country. We will have to set the immigration levels at a responsible threshold, but give proper opportunities both to Canadians and people coming from abroad. Newcomers create jobs in Canada. That has always been the case, and it will still be the case in future. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Ryan Tilty, National Post, line open.
Yeah, good morning, sir. I'm wondering, the negotiations are ongoing over the reopening of Parliament, which is set to start on Monday. I'm wondering what your position is. Do you want the status quo to continue? Do you want to see some sort of larger Parliament, some sort of hybrid model? What are you looking for?
I think we want what Canadians want, to make sure that there's a functioning parliament that will ensure that questions and preoccupations from across the country get heard. There are certainly non-COVID things we could be moving forward on, but I think the focus will always need to be on this exceptional situation we're in and our government's and our country's response to that. Those discussions continue to be ongoing, and I know that all parties are united in wanting to ensure that we continue, as we have been, to demonstrate that our democracy is strong and our institutions are functioning, not just despite the crisis, but because of the crisis. Okay. Évidemment, il y a plusieurs enjeux dont il va
Of course, there are a number of issues that we will have to discuss in the coming weeks. Not all of them are directly linked to COVID-19, but the priority will be the crisis in which we are now involved. And we will continue those discussions with the other political parties because Canadians want a functioning parliament. For a number of weeks now, we've been sitting 3 times a week, and we will continue to get the work done so that we're making the right decisions for Canadians right across the country.
Thank you. Ryan, next question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, sir, do you envision an end to the virtual parliaments and more sessions in person? Do you see some sort of hybrid model? What do you physically expect Parliament to be in the coming weeks? And do you think it should extend its sitting through the summer?
These are conversations that are ongoing between all party leaders. I think obviously we will be physically present in reduced numbers regardless of what the final decision is by all parties. There will have to be a way for parliamentarians across the country to express the concerns and ask questions on behalf of their constituents. These are the kinds of things that we're working out, and I know just as we have been able to sit over the past weeks 3 times a week and continue the functioning of our Parliament, we will be able to continue that into the coming weeks.
Just as we were able to respond to questions and ensure that Canadians right across the country are properly represented in Parliament in recent weeks, we will continue to work to ensure that our democracy is functioning properly in the coming weeks.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Jordan Press, the Canadian Press. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Just on the contact tracing, can you provide some specifics about the timelines that your government is going through to make sure that all these separate efforts in provinces are actually consistent, not siloed, and that the federal government is actually making sure there's a national effort to ramp up testing?
Well, we know that part of the reopening of the economy will involve Canadians traveling more within their provinces and potentially across the country. That's why we need to have a national approach that is going to be able to have comparable data right across the country and comparable tools. Even in regions where the spread of the virus seems very much under control right now, there could be a resurgence. And when that happens, we need to be able to respond quickly and comprehensively. And that's very much what the federal government is working on. We know, and we've heard from provinces, that contact tracing is a challenge in terms of delivering the bodies necessary to make the phone calls, to trace everyone a positive test could have been in contact with in the previous days. That's why we've put forward the logistical support to be able to deliver that to any province across the country.
A follow-up, Jordan?
As my follow-up, I want to go to something else. Last week, the Premier of Nova Scotia said he would wait and see whether Ottawa is willing to hold a public inquiry into the mass shooting in his province. So very simply, Prime Minister, will you commit that your government will lead an independent public inquiry into the shooting?
I think people have many questions about what happened in Nova Scotia, and we're encouraging the RCMP to do its work on the initial investigation. But as we move forward, there will, of course, be larger questions to ask, and we will work with the Government of Nova Scotia on getting those answers. We know
that the RCMP will continue to conduct its investigation on exactly what happened in Nova Scotia, but of course there will be more questions, and the Government of Canada is perfectly prepared to work with the Government of Nova Scotia to find answers to those questions.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Salima Shifty, CBC. I want to go back to contact tracing. You're offering several thousand federal employees to help with that, but if only Ontario has signed on and not Quebec, how does that square with the immediate improvement that you were talking about earlier? And is the message of urgency being lost here?
We have been reaching out over the past week to all provinces to determine what their plan is on contact tracing, what exactly they are doing, and whether or not not they need more help. We have highlighted that we have more resources that can be deployed immediately. They've been in place for a while, and we certainly hope to hear back from the provinces that could need this quickly to tell us whether and how they want us to help. A number of provinces have, some have not yet. Okay.
For a number of days, we have been telling the provinces that we have available resources, and we ask them directly what their plans are with contact tracing and what their capacity is, and whether they need help or want more resources to do that. A number of provinces answered, and some have not yet responded to that, but we hope to be able to help right across the the country, particularly in those areas that need help.
Apple and Google have actually said that their tracking platforms will require one app per country, and there is a need for this to happen quickly. Obviously, we've been waiting an announcement for this for weeks. People need to download the app. Will Ottawa step in and impose one app for provinces to use to make digital tracing as effective as possible?
Around the world, there have been a number of different apps developed, Singapore, Australia, other places. One of the challenges that those apps have encountered is that it has to sit in the foreground of your phone and drains the battery. That's why the fix that Apple and Google are talking about bringing in the beginning of June will be extremely important as a base for an effective contact tracing or exposure notification app. We are working with a number of different partners on potential apps. We're working closely with Apple and Google on the update that they will be bringing forward, and it is our expectation that when the time comes for that to be released, we will be able to recommend strongly to Canadians a particular app that will help us manage the spread of COVID-19. Okay. The
applications that have been developed around the world to fight COVID-19 would be improved if they incorporate a change that Apple and Google are now making in their systems. This is something that should be released in June, and we are hoping to be able to recommend an application to Canadians at that time so that we can help to control the spread of the virus.
Glenn McGregor, CTV News. Prime Minister, I want to ask about the situation in Hong Kong. As you know, the Chinese government is considering very serious security legislation that's going to really change the situation on the ground there, for at least for the 300,000 Canadians who are there now, and could very likely end the one country, two systems arrangement that they've had for a while. What's your message to Beijing now, and would you consider any kind of sanctions or any formal diplomatic rebuke if the government proceeds with this?
We are concerned with the situation in Hong Kong. We have 300,000 Canadians who live in Hong Kong, and that's one of the reasons why we want to ensure that the one country, two systems approach continues for Hong Kong. We have long called for a de-escalation of tensions and genuine dialogue with Hong Kong, between Hong Kong citizens and Beijing. We continue to call for that, and we will keep monitoring the situation closely. We're
very concerned about the situation in Hong Kong and have been for a long time. There are 300,000 Canadians living there, and the approach of one country and two systems that's been in place in Hong Kong continues to be very important. We have made it clear to Beijing that it's very important to pursue that dialogue with the citizens of Hong Kong and to reduce the tensions there.
Steve Chase, Globe and Mail. Prime Minister, I want to ask you what you're doing to protect the intellectual property that's being generated by this $1.2 billion you've poured into COVID-related research. Canada's one of Canada's spy agencies, CSIS, sent a note to bulletin to university researchers and academics, warning them that there are increased risks right now, and particularly because people are working from home, particularly because there's a lot of international collaboration taking place. The FBI sent out a similar warning, but unlike Canada, they actually identified the country they're most concerned about as China. So my question for you is, what are you doing to protect us? Can you tell us anything about the breaches that have taken place so far? And are you going to build some kind of international coalition with other countries to confront China?
We have long been concerned about intellectual property protections in Canada. That's why we've increased the funding for the CSC, which is a communication security establishment that watches over cyber attacks and makes sure that our systems are safe. The CSC is among the best intelligence agencies in the world in terms of that, and work constantly with partners all around the world, with Five Eyes and others. We will continue to make sure that they have the tools necessary to keep Canadians and our institutions safe. And part of that involves notifying, but part of that involves working behind the scenes to keep Canadians' information and data protected. We will continue to ensure that they have the tools to do their work.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau. Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada.
Louis Blouin, Radio-Canada. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. You are now negotiating with the opposition parties for the suspension of work. Now, with respect to the CERB, is that part of your negotiations? The Bloc is asking you to introduce a more progressive model to allow people or encourage people to return to work. Is that part of what your plans are? And when do you expect to make a decision on this? Well, I think there are two parts of this negotiation when it comes to the return of Parliament. We are focusing on the structure that will allow all Canadians right across the country to be properly represented in a Parliament that will be limited in terms of people there in person and others who will be participating by video conference. The other issue has to do with technology and logistics decisions related to the return of Parliament. Now, there are parties making suggestions and recommendations to improve some of the programs that are there for Canadians in order to better help Canadians and businesses in this crisis, and that's what we continue to work on with them. But we prefer to separate the discussions on the return to Parliament from those with respect to amending specific policies.
There are two things that are being discussed that are a little bit blended in some people's views that we tend to keep a little more separate. There are reflections on how Parliament is coming back, how we will ensure that our institutions, our democracy continues to function strongly as it has over the past few weeks with 3 sessions a week. We know that going forward we're going to keep working and need to bring forward new issues. And then there is the other reflection on proposals and suggestions made by other parties on how to improve the benefits we're sending to Canadians, how to facilitate the reopening of the economy, and those conversations will continue on a separate track.
Hier, le Premier ministre du Québec,
François Legault, said he was competing with the CERB, and this is harming the ability of people to return to work. Well, we are in a situation where millions of Canadians have no job, where tens of millions of students that were relying on a summer job this year in order to pay their rent or pay their tuition will not have a summer job. We need to be there to support people who need help, and that's exactly what we're doing. The unemployment rate among young people is close to 35%. Young people want to work, they want to contribute, but they want to receive the necessary support, and that's why we brought in the emergency student benefit.
We know that millions of Canadians are off work right now, and tens of thousands of students who were relying on summer jobs to be able to pay for their groceries, their rent, their tuition fees, are not going to be able to find those any summer jobs. We needed to make sure that we're supporting those students so that they can continue in their path to higher education so that they can continue to contribute to society. I know lots of young people want to contribute. That's why we're creating more jobs, more opportunities for them to develop experience. But we also needed to make sure that they were supported during this summer of unemployment, and that's exactly what we've done.
Hi, Prime Minister. Crystal O, Global News. The number of cases of COVID-19 among military members helping in Ontario and Quebec long-term care homes has doubled in the past week. Why is the military not yet receiving hazard pay when they are clearly at an increased risk?
These are discussions that are ongoing within the military. We need to thank the women and men of the armed forces for stepping up yet again whenever they are called on to go into difficult or risky situations to do the work of protecting Canadians. This is what they're doing. We thank them. We salute them.
And you've had several calls this week to advance Canada's candidacy for the UN Security Council seat. As any diplomat who's tracked these votes knows, there's a heavy amount of horse trading for support. So what is Canada offering? Financial aid, votes for other candidates? What will you offer Arab countries this afternoon for their support? And what did you offer other countries and leaders earlier this week in exchange for their support?
From the beginning, Canada has framed our engagement for the UN Security Council as a means to an end. And what we are doing is demonstrating how we see the importance of multilateralism around the world, how we see a need to work together across borders to improve the situation both during this COVID crisis and contribute to a better world moving forward. Canada's voice is one that brings people together on the world stage, and we will continue to play a significant role. We are big enough to make a difference on the Council, but small enough to know that we can't do it alone. Our capacity to pull people together, to represent and reflect the diversity of the planet within our own population and make that diversity and difference a source of strength, not just within Canada, but in our multilateral organizations, is why we know that Canada has an important role to play, and Canadians have an important voice that needs to be heard on the UN Security Council going forward. Le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies.
The UN Security Council and a seat there is not a goal in itself. It's an opportunity for Canadians to continue to have a positive impact on the world. We deeply believe in multiculturalism, and during this crisis, we need to work together. And we want to think about the world we're going to create coming out of this crisis. We want countries that use proper values and principles, and we want proper diversity around the planet as well, so that we can work together on climate change or on economic investments in developing countries or on technology and science. We have a role to play, and Canadians on the Security Council will have a positive impact on the world as a whole. And that's what I tell people when I speak to other world leaders, as we also talk about challenges associated with climate change and COVID-19 that are also on the agenda during these conversations. Thank you all very much.
That is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Friday, giving us an update on his government's response to the pandemic. Last couple of questions there about the Canada's bid to win a seat at the Security Council at the United Nations. The Prime Minister has a call with Arab nations later this afternoon to make that pitch. And there's a very good Canadian press story out right now about the ambassador to the United Nations heading back down to New York to begin that final push to try and win the seat for Canada. That happens in June. That vote. But lots of other bits of news there from the Prime Minister. So let me bring in my colleagues, Vashi Kapellas and Catherine Cullen. Vashi, lots of information and notions and ideas about contact tracing and testing, as well as really almost a plea to provinces that haven't asked for help to really ask for it, because the federal government's standing by.
Yeah, it was interesting. A lot of broad strokes, a lot, as you're saying, Rosie, a lot of notions put forward, not a lot of specifics when it comes to what the goal should be. A very specific question from our colleague Jordan Press at the Canadian Press. What exactly does the level of contact tracing need to be in order for Canadians to feel safe? And there wasn't a specific answer there, but there are some numbers that the Prime Minister did provide, namely that there are civil servants that can make 3,600 contact tracing calls a day, 7 days a week. and that there are also a number of people, 1,700 Canadians working with Statistics Canada, that can make an additional 20,000 calls a day, and they are ready to go. He says Ontario specifically, he named that province as one that has asked for help. He did not specifically name others, but said that some don't need it necessarily to the same degree. So my mind initially goes right to Quebec, and I wonder whether or not there is a process there, or whether there's something more to that part of the story. I know that from my conversations with people who work with the Prime Minister, of all the relationships with provinces, and this is not necessarily unexpected during this pandemic, which have largely all been very positive, including with Quebec, the points of tension certainly with Quebec are higher, I guess I could say, to be as accurate as possible based on my conversations, than with other provinces. So that's something to keep our eye on. I think when it comes to contact tracing as well, based on another question from our colleague Salima Shivji, that she got some information from our colleague Phil Ling, who you often name as very helpful because he is, around a contact tracing app. So the idea that Apple and Google only want one app per country, whether the Prime Minister has discussions ongoing with that, whether that will be the case. And I thought that his answer was actually very interesting, because while he didn't explicitly say, yes, we're going to procure this app, there's only going to be one app and every province is going to have to sign on. He didn't say anything like that. He did say that they will arrive at a point where, he hopes they arrive at a point where they will be able to recommend strongly to Canadians that they use a particular app. If I'm reading between the lines, that means to me that there will be, the goal is to have a deal with Apple and Google, to have that one app, and for that to be the primary mechanism, at least from a technological point of view, for contact tracing in this country. So that comment certainly jumped out at me, and that will be something for us to keep our eyes on, how those discussions progress and when exactly. I think he mentioned the summer.
June,
I think.
Yeah, June,
thank you. June. Yeah. So not too long. We should have a clearer picture of sort of the technological aspect of contact tracing and how it might play out in this country.
Yeah, I will say he definitely seemed to know more about the apps than I did, right? And understand them better than I do. So it's good to know that there are conversations ongoing with Google and Apple, who are supporting the data behind whatever app we decide to go with, because we also have some information that on that call with the premiers last night, some of the concern was the inter-provincial travel. And if you all have different apps, then how does that even work? How do you feed into that if you're trying to make sure that we can contain and contact trace? Catherine, what stood out there for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what's interesting about what Vashi just outlined was obviously all of this was framed very much as a collaborative effort, as we have heard over and over again since the beginning of this outbreak. So much talk about how it's the most collaborative it's ever been, Team Canada effort. And that sort of positivity, I will say, was how the Prime Minister approached this today. But I think implicit in what he said is, listen, the money is there, the people are there, we are giving you everything you need. You just have to ask for it. And it does implicitly, I think, put a bit of pressure on the provinces and territories that the federal government says it is making everything possible available. So this work has to get done. I think that was implicit in what the Prime Minister said today. And of course, we all want to know which provinces it is that have grabbed onto that help that the Prime Minister has offered, and which ones they're still waiting to hear from. I think Vashi's very right to mention Quebec. We're all wondering if that's the source of this.
Yeah, I mean, if he made a point of mentioning Ontario as someone who has reached out and who has still cases trending upward, and not mentioning Quebec, he said some provinces have and some provinces have not yet. So it might be an attempt to apply some delicate pressure to Premier Legault to reach out to help that is there and that may well be needed. I just want to end on China, if I can, because I know you're both tracking that story on different angles. He was asked about the situation in terms of the further restrictions from China on Hong Kong. Catherine, maybe I'll get you to start on that.
Yeah, I was really struck by his choice of language. I know Vashi interviewed François-Philippe Champagne last night on her show, and really kind of hearing similar phrases from the Prime Minister today. We are concerned. There is a need for dialogue. I'm just really struck in the contrast in tone between what he is saying and what the Secretary of State in the United States is saying. Obviously, Canada's relationship with China, very different from the U.S. relationship with China, and there are a lot of issues in particular in the background of Canada's relationship with China right now that we can talk about in a moment. But if I can find the quote from Mike Pompeo right now, essentially just condemning the move by China, saying it's not acceptable. Protesters in Hong Kong have said that China's move to impose this new security law, and in that law perhaps have security agencies from Beijing actually set up office in Hong Kong, that this is the end of Hong Kong as they know it, that the sort of freedoms that they have enjoyed could be destroyed by this. The Prime Minister, I would say, quite cautious in the tone, certainly in contrast to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that has been part of the story of the pandemic is how governments respond to China or describe their interactions with China throughout all of this. It does seem like China's sort of picking up where it left off with Hong Kong as things had, seemed to die down around democracy protests and whatnot, and now China's back there sort of I don't know, trying to, again, take control in some way or anyway dictate the way things unfold in Hong Kong, Vashi?
Yeah, I think what's important to underscore is it speaks exactly to what you just laid out, Rosie. So this new security law, which is expected to be basically rubber stamped, essentially will target those who protest against the communist regime in China. We've already seen, based on a previous extradition law, a huge number of protests, many of which actually ended up turning violent. And we have to remember there are 300,000 Canadians who live in Hong Kong. It's a dangerous situation, so much so that I believe a notice went out, a sort of diplomatic notice today, saying we are expecting increased protests based on the introduction of this security law. And Catherine is absolutely right. I was able to pull up the quote she referenced from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. The United States condemns the proposal to unilaterally and arbitrarily impose national security legislation on Hong Kong. That was not what the Prime Minister said, and he echoed what François-Philippe Champagne, the Foreign Affairs Minister, said, in that they're basically awaiting further details. They're waiting to see how it plays out. But the word that he used was concern, the same one that Minister Champagne did. They're very concerned. They've long called for de-escalation. He said they will continue monitoring the situation, and they do. He reiterated the federal government's support for a one-country, two-system approach. That is different than what we are beginning to hear from some world leaders. But I would add a note of caution. It's not as widespread, for example, as initially when the extradition law was floated. So we'll have to wait and see basically where does the international conversation goes, and are we seen as a laggard, as we have been in certain other instances involving Hong Kong in the past, or does the federal government, take a different approach? They are, of course, trying to navigate the fact that for more than 500 days, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor have been arbitrarily detained in China.
Yeah, very careful language from Canadian politicians there. And on the other issue, too, about potential security breaches on research being done inside Canada, where, again, the U.S. very firmly pointed to China as one of the nations that might be doing that spying or trying to tap into some of that research. Canada wouldn't go down that road to name any of the nation states that might be involved in that. Okay, I'm going to leave you both there. Thank you very much for your coverage, as usual. Vashi Kapellas, her show, Power and Politics, on at 5 Eastern on CBC News Network, and Catherine Cullen, you can probably catch her on The National later tonight. Thank you both. Appreciate it.